folks, welcome. And we are continuing our discussion of the history of early modern philosophy. And this time around, we are taking a second look at the question of innate ideas. So last time around, we saw Locke's attack on the idea of innate ideas. Now we're going to be looking to Leibniz as a defender of the notion. Here's the plan for today. And as you might notice, we're recording outside just because it's such a beautiful day today. Without any further ado, here's the plan. How does Leibniz counter Locke's attack on innate ideas? What's kind of interesting is this particular piece that I'm drawing from, New Essays on Understanding, I believe is the title. Let's get the exact right title. New Essays on Human Understanding, excuse me. So this was a piece written by Leibniz directly in response to Locke. So we're going to be able to actually see two of, the famous philosophers of the period really in dialogue with one another. So here's our question. How does Leibniz counter Locke's attack? Well, here's going to be Leibniz's approach in the New Essays. He's going to argue that the senses are necessary but not sufficient for all knowledge, and he's going to point to logic, math, and morality. I'm going to give what we might call the discernability argument against Locke's picture of the blank slate. And in the context of this discernability argument, we're going to see Leibniz challenging one of the central planks of Locke's idea that there couldn't be any innate ideas. And this is partly based on Locke's idea that you cannot have an idea that you are not aware of. So every idea that you have is supposed to be present to your mind for Locke. Well, Leibniz is going to challenge that view. So we're going to look at a challenge to Locke's argument that all ideas are present to your awareness. And finally, we will get what I might think of as a counter-metaphor. One of the things that's really lasting about Locke isn't as much the arguments for his empiricist view of knowledge acquisition, but we might even say that the metaphor lives even longer than the arguments, where Locke tells us that the mind is a blank slate, the tabula rasa, or, as in some places Locke puts it, blank pieces of paper void of characters. It's supposed to be the experiences you have that imprint the paper with characters. Right? So those are things we're going to look at, whereas Locke says that the mind is a blank slate. Leibniz is going to give us this interesting counter-metaphor claiming that the mind is kind of like a block of veined marble. And we'll see what's going on with that metaphor as we proceed. So, first line of thought. Leibniz is going to tell us that the senses are insufficient to explain everything that you know. So he says, there is a sense in which, maybe we'll give this plane a second to pass, one of the travails of recording outdoors. So how are the senses insufficient for all your knowledge? Well, we might think that the senses only tell you so much. And it might be the case that you wouldn't know anything if you never had any sensory experiences. You would remain without knowledge. But the senses will not get you all the way there. So we might say, some beliefs that you have are learned through instances, and some things that you know are based on experience. So when I come to realize that this coffee that I'm drinking is warm and bitter, that's learned through sensory experience. Leibniz would admit so much. And we might say that this is an instance of learning through instances. And in fact, Leibniz sort of gets a step ahead of Hume. Hume gives the famous example of knowing that the sun will rise tomorrow. Well, Leibniz thinks about this example as well. And he says, well, in fact, what we're doing when we come to believe that the sun will rise tomorrow is we are seeing a bunch of instances of the sun rising, and we make this inference that, yes, so for the rest of time, the sun will continue to rise. Leibniz says this is actually a demonstrably false argument. If you are living up in the Arctic Circle, for instance, you could go for a long period of time where the sun doesn't rise at all for several weeks. And then in the summer, you will go through a period where the sun doesn't set at all for several weeks. Leibniz also points out the sun will not always exist and the earth will not always exist. So in a sense, going from instances will not get you fail-safe knowledge, right? So we can actually say that reasoning from instances to make claims about what's necessary is often faulty. There are places in this chapter where Leibniz says that this is reasoning like a brute. That is, it is through experiences and habit that, for instance, my dog learns that it's time to eat dinner after I've finished mine, right? So there is this way in which you can be led astray through pure, what we might call like animal reasoning, that is just based on experience. But Leibniz is going to point out that not all reasoning involves simple inference from the senses. So he gives the examples of logic, morality, and metaphysics. So a logical bit of knowledge we might think of modus ponens, right? This is the argument structure that says if P then Q, P therefore Q. And the logical insight that you can draw out of this is that if our two premises are true, if P then Q and P, on pain of contradiction, could we deny the Q, the conclusion, right? Now, the way that you learn modus ponens is true is not by looking at one modus ponens argument. So, like, if Bo is a dog, then Bo is a mammal, Bo is a dog, therefore Bo is a mammal. And then I look at the other dog in the yard, the dog that I'm babysitting for now. If Boz is a dog, Boz is a mammal, Boz is a dog, therefore Boz is a mammal. Right? These are instances of modus ponens reasoning, but it's not as if I learn that modus ponens is a valid argument form, that it has this special structure that guarantees true conclusions with true premises. I don't learn this through inference. I learn it through what Leibniz might think of as like a rational insight, a recognition that these arguments all share in a special structure which has to be true. You don't learn that through instances. As I said, it might be some kind of rational insight. Similar thing with morality. You don't learn that it's wrong to murder people by thinking about one murder, noticing it's wrong, another murder, noticing it's wrong, but rather there's rational insight into the principle. Or metaphysics, right? If I come to the metaphysical insight that this coffee mug is a combination of coffee mug matter with coffee mug form, well, that is not directly learned from experience, right? It is something that we learn through what we might think of as a rational insight. Here's how Leibniz puts it. Proof of the underlying principles of logic or morality or metaphysics can come only from what Leibniz calls inner principles, which can be described as innate. So the principle that helps you draw all these things together couldn't be gotten from simple sensory experience. So that principle must be innate within you. Now, we'll also notice that Locke points out that many self-evident truths need not be innate, right? So Locke pointed out that a thing cannot be in two places at one time. He says this is self-evident, and you can learn it by reflection. Another example of knowledge via reflection for Locke is the insight that black and white are different things. Or we could say a similar one, yellow is more like orange than it is like blue, right? Now, this is not just simple sense. This is not simple sense receptivity of the sense organs. Locke is saying we do this other thing where we reflect on the processes of our own minds and our experiences and note conceptual connections, we might say. But Leibniz counters, reflection is nothing but attention to what is already in us, and which the senses do not give us what we carry with us already. So there is a question here as to whether an empiricist like Locke is actually smuggling in the notion of innate ideas by talking about knowledge from reflection. So this is our first line of attack from Leibniz, that the senses can't get you to all of the knowledge that we have. That would be another way of saying that the senses are, as the slide puts it, insufficient. Here's a second argument. We can call this argument the discernability argument. So this is based on an important principle of Leibniz's, which is sometimes referred to as Leibniz's law. So here's the principle. Leibniz says for two things to be non-identical, that means distinct, right? We might say that there are two dogs in the yard with me right now. There is Bo and there is Boz. And we might say that they are not identical, right? They are not one and the same dog. They are two different dogs. Now, because of this, we might say that it must be the case that they differ in some property. They cannot be exactly the same. So I could point out, for instance, that Bo is a little older than Boz, or that Bo is sort of brown, red-haired, and skinny, whereas Boz is blonde-haired and more full-figured. So we might say these two dogs are not one and the same, and because that's the case, there is always some discernible difference between the two, right? If Bo and Boz had every quality that was exactly the same, right down to age and location of birth, well, then it would be impossible for them to be distinct dogs. They would have to be one and the same, right? So anytime that you perceive that two things are different, so I can, look at my coffee mug and my keyboard, I can say, look, these two things have differences to them. Well, because of that, we can say, that's proof that they're not identical. Now, here's how this is important for the debate about innate ideas. Well, it comes back to Locke's idea that the mind is a blank slate. Because Locke seems to be claiming that each mind at the start is completely empty, and, as he says, it's like a piece of white paper without any characters on it. But if that were true, then the two empty minds would be indiscernible. If they were discernible, then they wouldn't be completely empty or void of characters anymore. But if they're exactly the same, if they're both perfectly empty, then they're indiscernible and therefore identical. But we might say, look, my mind at the start was not your mind at the start. That's absurd, right? So we're using Leibniz's law. We apply it to Locke's blank slate theory of the mind, and we say, look, we couldn't have two perfectly empty minds. So as Leibniz puts it, in consequence of the imperceptible variations, no two things could be perfectly alike. And this puts an end to the blank tablets of a soul without thought, a substance without action. They are something which the nature of things does not allow of. Nothing could make them acceptable, short of their being confined to abstractions of the mind. So what we're noticing here is that for Leibniz, he's going to say, look, no two things are exactly alike, but that means that we could not have two minds that are perfectly empty. And what's really going on is Leibniz is going to say, in nature, in reality, there are never two things that are exactly alike. I wonder about this argument. So for instance, it does occur to me that there are things that are completely empty in the ordinary language sense of that terminology. So inside my house, I have a ream of paper for printing out things to read and notes and so forth. And within that ream of paper, I have, like 500 sheets of blank white paper. Now, I think that we could point out to Leibniz that, look, in some sense, these are indiscernible, right? If we looked at a particular fragment of these paper pieces under a microscope, we might notice that the pattern of fibers within the paper would actually make the two pieces discernible. So for instance, just like no two fingerprints are exactly alike, no pieces of blank paper are exactly alike, but they're still blank. Now, I think that Leibniz should probably come back at this analogy and say, look, but the mind is not a thing. The mind is a series of activities. And we might say that even if the mind sort of seems like it might be blank at the start, there's actually stuff going on in it. And for two minds to actually be minds and to actually be distinct, we're going to have different perceptions going on in these minds, even though they seem blank, even though they seem empty. Now, if you're paying attention to Locke's argument, you might say, we've got a problem here, right? Locke is going to say, well, the idea of having ideas that you're not aware of is just absurd, right? So Locke is going to say there is no such thing as a thought unthunk, right? To be something that you're unaware of disqualifies that thing from being a thought. But it seems like Leibniz is going to say, even if your mind seems like it doesn't have anything going on in it, seems like it's a blank page, Leibniz is willing to go in on the idea that the soul has thoughts which go unperceived. So we're going to need to examine that line of thought. This line of thought that asserts that there could be an unperceived idea. Just to refresh you, here's Locke saying that there is no such thing as an unperceived thought. He says, for to imprint anything on the mind without the mind's perceiving it seems to me hardly intelligible. He says that Book 1, Chapter 2, Section 5. This is the section where he claims that if you're going to argue for innate ideas from universal assent, we should notice that babies and beasts lack many thoughts that are allegedly innate. And moreover, we don't want to claim that you have an innate idea but you're not aware of it. That's what's unintelligible to Locke. But Leibniz replies, there are hundreds of indications leading us to conclude that at every moment there is in us an infinity of perceptions unaccompanied by awareness or reflection. That is, of alterations in the soul itself, of which we are unaware because these impressions are either too minute and too numerous or else too unvarying, so they are not sufficiently distinctive on their own. This is a really interesting line of thought, and maybe you've noticed this at some points in your life, right? You're sitting in a room reading, and all of a sudden the air conditioner, which has been running and running loudly for a long time, kicks off. And all of a sudden it's suddenly and perceptibly quiet. Well, you might say that you were sensing the sound of the air conditioner, but you weren't aware of it, right? So this is the idea of perceptions without awareness. Leibniz also gives us the example of the sounds of waves. You're standing by the ocean, and you hear the roar of the ocean moving, but you might not notice the individual parts of the ocean moving, right? Or you're not going to hear a single water droplet, but when 1,000,000 water droplets fall and make a waterfall, they become perceptible. Or, this is an example that comes to mind for me as a person who's into music, you will hear each of the strings when a 12-string guitar is strummed, but you will not be able to pick out each individual note coming from each individual string. We might say that the sounds there are too minute, too numerous, or not sufficiently different from one another. Now, this is important for the debate about innate ideas, because if you accept that there can be an idea in your soul which you are not aware of, well, that could make room for the idea that you have an innate idea in you which evades your awareness. And this could be used to undercut Locke's argument that it's incoherent to say your ideas are innate, but you're not aware of them. Leibniz says we have ideas that are in us, but that are not present to our awareness all the time. One other point, and Leibniz does press on this, it's that memory is a mental state, right? And it's one that you're not constantly aware of. So if I ask you to name the capital city of North Carolina or the capital city of Texas, you might say, yes, Raleigh and Austin. If you did remember those things. You could think of any other number of bits of trivia, your parents' phone number. You probably weren't thinking about that until I mentioned it. That is a mental state of yours that you're not constantly aware of. And in fact, Leibniz is happy to align his way of thinking with Plato and Plato's defense of innate ideas, which is developed through the theory of recollection, right? So maybe you have some philosophical truths at the back of your mind, and when we philosophize, what we're doing is we are bringing ideas that were already in us up to the forefront of our mind. This line of thought is meant to undercut Locke's idea that it's just incoherent to talk about an idea that is unperceived. So, if we're buying into this line of thought that Leibniz has, we have undercut the blank slate theory of the mind and the blank slate theory of learning. So I'm going to leave you with a metaphor, right? The blank slate metaphor is a powerful one. I think that Leibniz is aware of how powerful the metaphor is, so he gives us a competing metaphor. Here's what he says. If the soul were like these empty tablets, truths would be us, as in the shape of Hercules is in a block of marble, when the marble is indifferent to receiving this shape or another. So the thought is, if we take the blank slate theory true, the mind is completely malleable. Different experiences could give you different things. So for instance, we could take this indifferent piece of marble and we could carve Hercules into it, but we could also carve a dog or a different person, or we could make a countertop with it, right? But, here's the but. Leibniz says, if the stone had veins which marked out the shape of Hercules rather than other shapes, then that block would be more determined with respect to that shape, and Hercules would be as though innate in it in some sense, even though some labor would be required for those veins to be exposed and for Hercules to be polished into clarity. And Leibniz says, this is how ideas and truths are innate in us. So here's the thought. Imagine we had this piece of marble that as soon as you knock it, the veins in the marble just crumble away, and all of a sudden Hercules, fully formed, shows up in the marble. There's a couple of interesting insights here. One is that just like this veined marble might need a few taps to get started, you might need to have a few experiences to unveil your innate ideas. But he's also pointing out, look, the mind has certain tendencies or potentialities that if this block of marble has this predilection towards becoming a Hercules shape prior to any experience, we might say that is a sense in which the shape of Hercules is in the marble before the workman, the sculptor, gets started on it. And we might try to see if we can think of the human mind being like that. So, for instance, the fact that human beings have a predilection to learn a few logical inferences and then learn a principle that underlies, right? Or that we are able to learn moral principles or engage in metaphysical thinking. Or the fact that we are able to learn languages. So the dogs here in the yard, there's one of them right there, they are not really able to learn language. Not in the full, robust sense that human beings are able to learn language, where they're able to put together new thoughts that they've never even thought before by using a bunch of recombinant parts. But the thought here is that maybe the human mind has some predilections, that it's able to, with minimal spurring on by nature, learn certain things or come to certain understandings. And this is the sense in which certain things that you know might already be in you. And simple sense experience wouldn't be sufficient to explain them. So, we've now got competing metaphors, right? On the one hand, we have Locke's blank slate theory of the human mind, white paper void of characters. On the other hand, we've gotten some arguments from Leibniz today. You might have ideas in you that you're not fully aware of. And also, it might be the case that experience on its own is not sufficient to get us to all the knowledge that we have. And in that way, we might think of the human mind as not simply a blank slate, but more like some veined marble with some shapes and some patterns already in it that can be brought out through certain experiences in combination with those predilections. So, I will leave it there for you to reflect on, this question of whether or not we have innate ideas. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.